The people of Tamriel cannot catch a break. Continental War, Plane Meld, Meteor Strikes, Mephala Nocturnal and the other guy. Dragons, vampires, orc stalkers, Dagon himself, and now some sort of pan-dimensional apocalypse? How can we even relate to a world of such never-ending disaster? Well, in 2022 it got a lot easier thanks to a breakthrough in immersive role-playing by ZeniMax Online Studios, who gave their players a mini-simulation of life in the Second Era. Crashes, nerfs, poor performance, furry companions, Update 35 and the accessibility paradox, bugs, player departures, and so much bickering that Blog had to go on sabbatical for a couple of months. Hiya, this is Maya from Ninja Pulse. If you love ESO, 2022 was rough. And now that Necrom has been announced, Zos would prefer we forgot about last year and moved on, but we shouldn't. Problems don't go away when you ignore them. Reviewing this stuff is the only way to learn from it and keep our perceptions up to date, hold the devs properly to account, and have smarter opinions and conversations in 2023. I've been going back over the updates, the bugs, and every scrap of communication from last year, but I decided to wait until after the reveal for the full picture. Also because I didn't want this drowned out by all the hype. There's already a lot that's been forgotten, or which looks different with hindsight, so let's recap the journey we took last year, why it wasn't all bad, how we, the players, sometimes made it worse, but most of all, why trust in the devs and interest in the game took such a big hit. ESO is not dying anytime soon, but it's out on the thin ice right now, and if Zos don't knock it out of the park this year, this game we all love so much could be in trouble. Let's rewind to a year ago and the announcement by Matt Fyraw of a multi-threaded rewrite of ESO's server architecture. This was a big deal, and they took time to test before committing to it. It was supposed to arrive in late 2022, that didn't happen, and now it's coming with this year's chapter. Sorry to start with something so dry, but it's easy to forget this is happening, and it's kind of the mammoth in the room. ESO is a world-class MMO held back by poor server performance. And this rewrite is supposed to dramatically improve server performance, so just imagine if it works. Zos could finally take credit for this huge project they were working on in the background all of last year. Yes, it's been delayed, and performance gains have been promised before, so we'll believe it when we see it, but it's worth keeping in mind when evaluating 2022. January 20th was the first in-game event. Always fun to revive old zones and assemble those morphing collectibles, but so many rewards are recycled, there's not much to spend tickets on unless you're new. Gina Bruno also did a Twitter Q&A and forum post about making it easier for players to see what's coming up, and making communications more transparent and responsive. This was a cool move, and they would go on to deliver on it. Things really got going with the High Isle reveal event on January 27th. Zos's big annual pitch to us to keep playing and keep paying. At one point, Rich Lambert called us
the best community in games.
I wonder if he still feels that way. Top-notch trailers as ever, and a solid presentation heavily geared towards newer players. In the Necrom reveal we just got 1 year on, Microsoft moved the introductory stuff to its own separate segment, so that meant the part with Pete Hines and Rich Lambert was much more compact and move along much faster. They didn't even name the new trial or dungeons, that stuff just went up on the website for us to find. Last year's reveal was much more waffly by comparison, but their pitch for High Isle was still genuinely exciting. The pitch for Tales of Tribute, however, fell a little flat. They struggled to articulate how it worked or why it existed. I think we all accept they wanted a gimmick to sell the chapter, but the overwhelming response was disappointment at seeing resources spent on this instead of something like a new skill line or new class. Just look at the response to the new Arcanist class by comparison. This is something people actually want and something they will actually use. Tales of Tribute turned out to be quite good, but that doesn't change the fact that nobody wanted it, and most of us don't even play it. I did a quick survey on the Ninja Pulse Discord, and most of us have never even done the tutorial. Of course, this doesn't reflect all players, but it's still bad. It's not easy to add a feature which appeals to everyone, but Tales of Tribute was not it. So all in all, a pretty good start to 2022. Our first combat preview for Update 33 Ascending Tide announced account-wide achievements and the final step in hybridization, dynamic scaling, to open the door to more build freedom and diversity. Alec Verish, although he'll always be Gilliam the Rogue to us, also said they plan to merge brutality and sorcery, but a year later and nothing has happened there. PTS was very chill compared with later in the year, but there was some grumbling about account-wide achievements. Gina explained they did this to trim the data footprint and improve load times, which sounds great. But it gave veterans fewer reasons to stick around and keep repeating content like trials. ZOS have a complicated relationship with their endgamers, but there's love on both sides, and the devs had a chance to show some here by recognizing that although trial progression is far from the only thing in ESO, it is an important and vibrant part of the game. And it depends on players who've already done hard modes and trifectas taking the time to teach others. Reworking the reward system, or at least announcing a future rework, would have scored big points with players like this. If you don't know what I mean, picture this. So someone comes to you for help with Cloud Rest hard mode. You know they fight backwards, but you stick a book and achievements are all done. So you'd be spending weeks, maybe months, watching other players learn stuff you already know. Earning achievements on another character was an extra motivation. And ZOS didn't even try to replace it. I know people who quit over this. And looking at the exodus that was to come later, I think account-wide achievements did more damage than we realized at the time. Maybe in 2023 we can pressure the devs to look at the reward system. It's not just for endgamers. Rewards which encourage, or accumulate with, repetition would incentivize people to actually learn content, rather than just buying a carry or scraping through it once to flex some title they think will make them happy. There's too much of that bullshit already, and account-wide achievements made it worse. We got our first Whitestrake's Mayhem in February, restoring Cyrodiil to a version of its former glory, throwing some red meat at the dwindling PvP community and reminding everyone else that PvP exists. On March 8th, we got a Prepare for Ascending Tide article with actual solid advice. Join a guild, read the patch notes, meet the NPCs. All good stuff. ZOS's gear recommendations were a bit laughable, but they probably need a longer article to cover such a complex topic. Still, official guidance for newer players is pretty scarce, and it was nice to see them step up here. The Ascending Tide launch on March 14th was a high point of 2022, although we didn't realize it at the time. It brought huge changes to the combat system and went pretty smoothly. Some Magicka players are still outraged that great swords and daggers are now available to them, but there's not much ZOS can do about these people. Hybridization was a long time coming. We were told exactly what to expect and given plenty of time to prepare. Plus, dynamic scaling did not wreck the combat system or cause crazy balance issues. And stamina comps finally became a thing once again. Ninja Pools has so many great stam players because no other guilds would let them join before this. I know it's dumb, but it was a common attitude, and ZOS solved it with a single stroke and pulled off one of the biggest changes to the combat system since release. They deserve credit for doing it so neatly. They also fixed that bug where you could kill yourself by jumping in Asylum. And the new dungeons were great. Shipwright's Regret is one of the best in years, and Nazare and Turning Tide were well-designed sets. I just wish they'd foreseen the impact this had on Necro supports, and maybe tweaked the toolkit to keep them more relevant. It wasn't all positive. Despite Gilliam's talk of diversity, the game became much more homogeneous, and you could argue we went from 12 damage classes down to 6, which begs the question, why hybridize in the first place? Accessibility and power creep got worse, and I don't think ZOS ever claimed it would improve performance. I think most players are happy with hybridization, and it's not like they owe us an explanation, but it would have been nice to know at the time what the goal was, and why sorcery and brutality still aren't merged. We're still waiting, and they diminished the great job they did by leaving it unfinished. There were launch bugs, of course, but the only major issue was the NA server slowing to a crawl during peak time. This took so long to fix that Matt Fireraw posted an explanation on the forums. It was actually cool to get a peek behind the curtain with such a detailed and nerdy post. It reminds you how much work it takes to keep this show on the road. As an apology, they tripled our weekly Seals of Endeavor and added extra login rewards for April. This is the ZOS we want when things go wrong. Responsive, candid, and gracious. Best dev team ever! But it didn't last. A few weeks later, it was the EU server's turn. We'd had the Jesters Festival, the last bit of database sharding, and now the Jubilee. But a lot of EU players couldn't even log in during the first 2 days, and the devs pretty much said, hey, it's the Jubilee, what do you expect? They just implemented a login queue so the free-to-play event wouldn't be disrupted. Heaven forbid. My discords were full of people saying, fuck this, I'm off to play Elden Ring, which had just come out. I know Zos's hands were tied, but having multiple events, sharding, and a free-to-play event all coincide, they gave themselves nowhere to go. You don't do server upgrades and rewrites if everything is working perfectly, so it can't have come as a total shock. And although the situation was different, the contrast with the NA response a few weeks before was stark. Instead of celebrating the game's anniversary, EU players were given fresh reasons to walk away. So, a great first update, a totally unnecessary snub to veteran players, and mixed handling of technical issues. Maybe Zos were preoccupied with the High Isle preview, which came out the next day on April 14th. It was a nice presentation, but I feel like as these become more slick, they become less sincere. The best part was definitely the conversation with the art director and writer for the zone, because you got a sense of all the work and care that went into building this world. Give us more stuff like this, and less about the trinkets you get for pre-purchasing. Next day, combat preview for update 34. Gideon promised to let the dust settle as the meta starts to re-solidify post-hybridization. This stuck out to me because meta has become such a dirty word. Yet here's our combat designer, who was a content creator before Zos hired him, using it deliberately in an official article. Whether he means maximum efficiency or popularly approved doesn't matter. Clearly meta is a concept Zos thinks about and is comfortable with. This shouldn't be controversial. It's normal in video games for certain loadouts to be stronger. Of course, don't listen to people who babble about meta without evidence, and ignore those who say there's no such thing. Meta is not a dirty word, and this article is all the proof anyone needs. The deep dive articles on boss design were also very cool. Interesting to read and worth checking out if you missed them. Not sure they qualify as deep dive, and some tantalizing questions were missed, like when you've got Mike Finnegan on your couch describing how he thinks about story and environment when designing a boss. How are you not asking for anecdotes, like how the hell they came up with the skeevatons in Frostvault? That would elevate these articles to another level for anyone nerdy enough to read them in the first place. They also talked a bit about their very highly trained playtesters. I'm sure that's a standard practice, but they could brag about it more because it's reassuring to hear. And again, go deeper. Do these guys try to skip mechanics? How hard is hard mode meant to be? Like, what percentage of players should be able to clear? I love ESO's dungeons. You get fun fights, loads of atmosphere, and really condensed storytelling, but they could be harder. And if Zos's testers are that good, they already know this. Anyway, give us more interviews with these people about their work on the game. It's great bridge building between devs and players, and whoever made this happen deserves a high five. But bridges can be burnt as well as built. Many players find Overland way too easy. It sucks when the big, scary master villain dies in 2 seconds. It ruins the story. Rich Lambert was asked in an interview about an optional veteran setting, and he said that some players find Overland challenging, so a harder version just can't be a priority. I actually think most players who find something they cannot do will try to figure out where they're going wrong, and in the process they'll learn about the combat system. Then veteran content wouldn't be such a huge shock to some people. But Rich's response was totally reasonable. Still, some people got real mad and it escalated on the forums, with players shit-talking the devs and one another until Zos threatened to shut it down. This is pretty embarrassing, when the devs create an official feedback thread and instead have to act like babysitters because we get carried away and make fools of ourselves. ESO players are far from the worst out there, but this happens more than it should. And it goes both ways. On April 29th, Zos did a Twitch stream to welcome their new lore master, but instead it became infamous for mods deleting any comment mentioning PvP. This was also pretty shameful and kind of sinister as well. Luckily, Sawman was on the case, made a video which spread quickly, worth a watch if you've missed it, and got an apology out of Zos a few days later. Well, They didn't actually say sorry, they never do, but the point is both sides need to act like adults if communication between devs and players is supposed to work. It's not that hard. The PCNA server finally got its hardware update on May 3rd, and we saw immediate performance improvements, especially in Cyrodiil. Sadly, these seem to fade, especially after update 35, but ZOS had told us not to expect anything in the first place. Again, a major undertaking that got done behind the scenes with minimal disruption. The only real issue on High Isle PTS was the Dragon Knight combustion passive, which had its cooldown increased by 500%. It looked like a typical ZOS sledgehammer nerf, and players were pissed off, but the devs stuck to their guns, and with hindsight, they were right. DK Sustain had been OP since Deadlands, and incoming sets like Pillager's Prophet and Oakensole were about to make Ultigen much easier, so DK Sustain and damage were fine. ZOS take a lot of flack sometimes for relying on their players to spot problems like this, but this time they anticipated something we didn't. A reminder that the players aren't always right about this stuff. So, as we approach the chapter launch, communication is emerging as something both sides need to work on. ZOS are usually great at choreographed communication like the reveal, deep dive articles, and combat previews, but could smarten themselves up when it comes to communicating on the fly. And we just need to keep our shit together. High Isle launched on June 6th, and it did not go well, at least not on NA. Servers went down at 9 AM EDT, supposedly for 2 hours, but morning, afternoon, and evening went by and nothing. Anyone who took the day off to play the big expansion they paid for, and which ZOS had hyped so hard, ended up sitting around waiting all day. ZOS had to pull overtime to get the server back up by 9 PM, 12 hours later. Gina posted updates throughout the day and won some big points with players thanking her personally on the forums, but still, High Isle launch was a bust. Shit happens, but losing the entire day of your big launch, when the stakes are highest and everybody's watching, it felt very ZeniMax. And it's a shame because High Isle deserved much of the hype they gave it. The zone is gorgeous, the setting and characters were great. It did feel like discovering a place and culture much more than Blackwood or Greymoor. Almost a throwback to Orsinium, which also revolved around characters, not cosmic threats. The villain was way too obvious, and in a tale of conspiracy, that's a pretty serious fail. The usual suspects this was not, but the script is so desperate to make sure players keep up that there was probably no more room in the budget for a larger cast of characters or more ambitious storytelling. Personally, I think ZOS have proven themselves by now and could let their writers take more risks. ESO players aren't stupid, we'll keep up. What else was in update 34? Munder Stones in the Armory, the new Quicksort wheel, AMD upscaling tech, an absolute ton of minor fixes, which always bodes well for a game when the devs are still bothering with teeny tiny bugs 8 years after release. It also proves that our feedback does go somewhere, so keep sending those reports. We also got the new card game, an awesome new trial, new sets, new antiquities, and of course, the Oakensole ring. We gotta stop and talk about this for a minute. In my opinion, it was a good idea. Not my cup of tea. You play the piano with both hands, you play football with both feet, and if Matt Firewall lets me use 2 bars, I'm gonna do it. But 1 bar players have always existed, and a mythic that reduces the penalty was a cool concept. It was just way too strong. It didn't reduce the penalty, it reversed it. Is there no one else memorably described it as the most broken set ever, and said the story of this mythic was one of the reasons he quit ESO after years of being a cheerleader for this game. Oakensole, in its original form, was just indefensible, especially in PvP where it was paid to win. Everyone wanted it because it was too strong not to use. Without Oakensole, you were at a disadvantage. That was clear even from PTS, and in a competitive environment like PvP, that meant a lot of people bought High Isle just for this mythic. This wasn't a coincidence. ZOS buffed Oakensole to crazy levels to bait the hook a week or 2 before release. They usually know better than to indulge in obvious pay-to-win tricks, but this looked blatant, calculated, and cynical. And then of course, having released a totally busted item, they had to nerf it. 1 patch of Broken Soul was all we got, and everyone who bought High Isle just for this mythic now felt ripped off. This bait and switch was another big moment in this year-long narrative of player trust slipping away. Maybe in a normal year, the grumbling would have died down, but the fun was just beginning. But before we get there, on June 16th, ZOS closed the class rep system, saying it wasn't needed anymore. It was always shrouded in mystery, and since I wasn't in it, I'm not qualified to comment. Some said closing it was a disgrace and proof that ZOS won't hear other points of view. I don't think that's fair. Nefaz, who was a class rep, had nothing but positive things to say. Of course, he's still bound by an NDA, but he made a point of saying that he wished everyone could see what happened with this program, because then we'd understand the insane amount of work the devs put in just to keep ESO going. Even stuff we take for granted. I thought that was revealing, and it's on point with one of the main themes of this video. We gotta stop acting like we know everything. That takes us pretty much up to the halfway point of the year. We had a great launch, a bad launch, some really effective community engagement by ZOS, as well as some stumbles and unintentional middle fingers to players, a stupidly broken mythic, and accusations of pay to win, people quitting or talking about quitting, and silly flare-ups on the forums. All in all, it was quite a dramatic first half, but it was nothing compared to the second. I'll cover that in a separate video coming soon, but some of the things we can do better this year should already be obvious. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.